Right. Well, we're just about 2 minutes after the hour here. I expect some people to continue to trickle in, but appreciate everyone who has joined us already. I'm very excited to have this conversation today. So thank you all for joining us. We've got a great conversation around a very complex topic that we know is making its way around executive discussions, and that's why we wanted to discuss with you today. So today we're talking about application security and risk with two of our expert consultants, Ben Dimmick and Anir Desai. Ben and Anir, I'll ask you both to introduce yourselves along with the role you typically play in the application risk and security scenario. Ben, why don't you jump in here?
Sure. Thanks, Christy. So my name is Ben Dimmick. I am the Director of Security Implementation Services here at Tevora. My team tends to tackle most of our technically heavy projects, whether they be implementation projects or just projects that are specifically focused around security tool implementation processes. And when it comes to a particular area of application security or DevSecOps, my team tends to get pulled in around again enabling the tools that are involved, as well as on a number of our projects that are dealing heavily with the execution of the DevSecOps program. And Anir?
Sounds good. Thank you, Ben. Hi, everyone. My name is Anir Desai. I'm the manager here at Tevora for Strategic Services. My team, primarily on an engagement similar to this, would be probably in charge of a risk assessment or an app risk assessment. So taking in that governance lens, we do an assessment. My team presents results to executives and board committees, audit committees on findings, any actionable items, and then any technical implementation we would pass on to Ben's team.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you both. Well, so before we get started, I do want to let everyone who's joined us know if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to have a response for you before the end of the session here. I probably won't go for the full hour, maybe 30 to 45 minutes here. And again, we'll try to reserve some time to answer some of the questions that might arise. But first, why don't we jump in and start off with why we're having this conversation to begin with? And Ben, I'll pass this over to you, but why is application security arising now more frequently as a topic of conversation among cybersecurity experts?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest things about it is that the whole DevOps movement has been a fairly new thing. It's really been very I guess I'd say I don't know if I'd say evolutionary or revolutionary, but it's been a significant change overall. Um, it's really involved taking a different approach to development and deployment of code and so on. And it's really led to a lot of different ways of operating for the organization, which has created a number of challenges on the information security end of things. In a lot of cases, it's a matter of similar to the transition from traditional data centers to the cloud. We're going through a lot of those same types of challenges now. The other thing that frequently is coming up as well is just the speed that these teams tend to operate at tends to be much quicker, and doesn't always lend to a lot of the same practices we've been using in the past to continue to operate in the same way. So we've seen a number of our clients that have effectively gotten stuck into a difficult state where they're trying to catch up to all of these new initiatives going on and trying to figure out how to really get them secured when there's just so much new and foreign that's difficult to really quantify and plan around.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think just to help us imagine this a little bit better, if you could give us an example of an organization you've worked with that may have found itself in the kind of situation you're describing, of course, without naming any names.
Sure. So I'll speak as a little bit of an aggregate, and then I'll try to get a little more specific with a couple of them, with still keeping the right level of vagueness associated with it. But so effectively, the biggest idea behind DevOps is making it simple to develop code, making it so that developers are spending as much of their time as possible writing code as opposed to having to assist with building out new environments, having to assist with testing efforts, and so on and so forth. And so as a result of that, there's really been a lot of organizations that took an approach of effectively keeping everybody away from those processes that could effectively be blocked from them. And frequently, InfoSec has been labeled as one of the components that's creating challenges there. Um, One of the issues, though, with this whole move fast approach is that the velocity associated with a number of attacks is substantially different than it was in the past. For instance, if in many cases, a lot of organizations are looking to do multiple code commits per day. We're talking, whereas, for instance, in the past, it might have been a monthly commit and an update to code. Now we're talking about daily, hourly, and so on and so forth. The problem there is that we can introduce a lot of new problems very quickly, and you won't necessarily know about them until they have manifested. It's frequently becoming more difficult to catch them earlier on when everything is moving so quickly if we don't get the right type of safeguards in place. I think probably one of the best examples I can give of this in the news has been the whole episode with SolarWinds. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with that one, and probably some of us are still feeling the sting of that whole situation a little bit. But it's a good example of how when someone can really get into the software supply chain, they can disrupt a lot of systems internally as well as externally. So going to your organization's clients, for instance, and using your platform to get access to their systems and their data and so on. So it's really become a bigger challenge in that sense. Um, the One of the biggest things that we found here as well, and one of the reasons why we're really trying to raise awareness, is because of that whole velocity component. We're finding that there's effectively two modes. The first one is we're building up defenses now and we're shoring up challenges and having better opportunities to identify and address them. Or we are instead just going straight to incident response. We're finding that because of the velocity these things are happening at, we really have to focus very heavily on building proactive controls as opposed to having a more reactive situation to it. By the time we've gotten to that incident response component of having a disruption in your software supply chain or your CI/CD pipeline and so on and so forth, in a lot of cases, we've really reached that point where the damage is now substantial, and it's creating some serious problems. Um, we found that we have a lot of clients that come in from a lot of different situations. And so for a lot of them, they don't necessarily find out they have a problem in many cases until, for instance, we're doing a penetration test or something else along those lines. And then all of a sudden it's a matter of this could have been detected in code a long time ago, but for some reason wasn't. But we've seen clients come in with lots of different scenarios as well, and we're trying to help them to get into a better state in that sense. For instance, we had one client that had several tools in place to aid on the security process, but they had found that developers were getting tired of addressing all of the security warnings they were getting from them, and so they effectively bypassed them. In some cases, there was some false positives, but the issue there was that no one was aware that was happening, and so there was a number of issues that slipped through that could have been remediated much more easily and earlier in the process. We've had, for instance, another one that had some automated tools in place, or rather had few automated tools in place, and we're relying much more heavily on manual code reviews. But the problem they were running into was that in their effort to move as quickly as possible, more and more of those were getting rubber stamped, and things were getting through. And so in a number of cases, it's a matter of getting the right tools in place, and in others, it's a matter of making sure that we're using those effectively.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's take a look at it from the risk assessment side as well. I mean, from your perspective, I'm sure you've evaluated some environments that reflect some of these same challenges. What have you seen out there?
So piggybacking off of what Ben was saying, right, that organizations are moving at a rapid pace. Um, Organizations are producing their own applications and then onboarding more vendor applications. Both are using faster and more agile methodologies to pivot, adjust, implement, you name it. The most common case that we run into is backlog application assessments, right? Application is sort of accounted for within key business and security areas, such as business continuity, disaster recovery, privacy, et cetera. But the process of identifying application risk and identification of trends among applications, data classification kind of gets left behind. Especially when it comes to the legacy apps or any third-party apps, especially when you have a vendor in play, things that you've configured to your environment. And then this becomes a major issue when teams are short-staffed too, right? Applications now require changes on a dime. Not only is the organization evolving, but that third-party app that you use internally, they're evolving too. And there's risks associated with that as well. Based on their integrations, their implementations, and their involvement to the threat landscape.
So considering all this, what are some of the consequences of a situation where, as you mentioned, Ben, development might have outpaced security efforts?
Yeah, so to kind of build on what Anir was touching on there, I think the whole, or I think a great example of this is really the third-party ecosystem around software development. Effectively, well, it's probably safe to say that virtually every application out there is using some type of third-party library in some capacity. So for instance, when Log4j came out, that was a major challenge for a lot of organizations because it was such a heavily used tool. And now my point by bringing that up isn't necessarily to say that that your teams need to begin doing testing on, or rather doing penetration testing and code analysis on every third-party library out there. It really comes more down to the idea of these things need to be addressed as part of the whole planning process. This can be a great example of how it can be difficult to recover from something like that. So, for instance, that one was a little bit easier for some because so many folks became so aware of it so quickly because it was very widespread. But if there was a lesser known library, making sure that there's components in place that can help to identify and address those immediately is a great example of how these things can come together. And really, the biggest thing here is making sure that the InfoSec team is getting a seat at the table and beginning to get involved in these discussions to start working through and planning around how to address some of these risks. That's been one of the biggest challenges we've seen from a number of clients. Is that effectively DevOps has left them behind, and they're having to constantly play catch up to go out and figure out how to actually get involved in these discussions without creating challenges that they get them uninvited from the table later on.
Yeah, that could be a problem. But let's say you, as the owner of security in your organization, you do recognize that this is a potentially problematic scenario where application development might be putting your company at risk. And from your perspective, where would you start in that scenario?
I'd say identification of applications to be evaluated is probably where I'd start. In a realistic scenario with the other mandatory compliance efforts, an organization realistically won't be able to get through all of their applications in one go. Especially since exactly what Ben was mentioning, the third-party element playing a role as well. Identification of the critical apps is where I'd start. Work with the app owners, the data owners. Is the app in-house developed or is it vendor app? The process can and should differ, right? The questions that you're asking, the security that you want to test and have that sense of mind, or is the safe sense of mind, you want to have that process that differs. I'd conduct an evaluation, right? You should have the app list, function, criticality, kind of documented somewhere. For a more larger, complex organization, they may be using a tool, for example. A more smaller, maybe manual. But at least you've kind of documented this to, or supplied this to an auditor at some point. Or you have a third-party management tool that you use, which may have some of this information as well. I'd say do an app risk assessment. If you haven't done a standalone app risk assessment in a while, it may be valuable to have just your scope focused on just the apps, right? One of the things that works really well that I've tested and clients have been responsive to is throwing out a scenario, right? Let's not do a full assessment that takes a long time, but let's throw a scenario at my apps, see if there's an incident response plan, a business continuity process that's associated with my apps. Is there MFA? It gets a lot of questions answered in a scenario-based format when you throw an adverse scenario at an application. Especially when time and SME time is valuable. Spending an hour doing a scenario-based analysis with the data owner, the app owner, the development team, or whatnot, you can get a lot done. Having a good questionnaire works too. I think that works. Saving SME time. I've seen this work a lot of the medical clients that we have. We have a robust questionnaire that we can send out. They fill it out. We have a conversation on the critical elements of that questionnaire. That takes about 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the app and the data that's being processed within.
No, that's a great idea. Well, let's talk about this from a developer's perspective then. How do you ensure that these problems don't arise to begin with?
Yeah, that's a good question. And one thing I do want to put out there first before I dive into that too heavily, but one thing that comes up a lot with a number of our clients too is the idea of we don't really have a development team. We don't have a dedicated DevOps department and that sort of thing. And so none of this really applies to us. And frankly speaking, I'm probably preaching to the choir because I'm guessing most of you that join this webinar, this is a topic of interest. But we're really encouraging all of our clients to begin adopting some type of SDLC. If you're not doing internal development now, it's only a matter of time until someone does, or until a third party is brought in externally to assist with that development process. And having some of these practices in place now can help to ensure that that process goes off smoothly when it does occur. But a few high level tips in the process, and I'll break it down here a little bit during the development process. Obviously, one of the biggest things that folks have been talking about for years is just developer training practices. The OWASP top 10 has been around for an awful long time. For instance, that's a strong source, but ensuring that developers know how to write secure code, what types of things to look for when they're doing reviews or writing their own code. These tend to be fairly huge and have a significant impact overall. Next thing is make sure that there are processes for manual code reviews. Again, in the interest of efficiency, we don't necessarily want to double the amount of work where one person writes a code and the other person spends the same amount of time reading said code, but at least having practices in place where everything can be reviewed to ensure that there hasn't been some type of a mistake does tend to be a strong option there. Everything should be reviewed before it goes to production in some capacity. Another thing is we've mentioned tools and their usefulness here. That tends to be a fairly strong component of a successful program too. And really coming down to automating those tools. There's a lot of talk about shifting left in the process, ensuring that we're really grabbing onto that stuff early on, providing developers with that particular feedback. So for instance, you develop this code and we use this tool to identify that there is a cross-site scripting vulnerability that's now been introduced. These are the lines where the tools are identifying it in the code. So now you can go through and get that remediated right away. Having those feedback loops for developers as well is also critical, because that helps them to improve and not make those same mistakes in the future as they're going through it. It basically helps them to make sure that doesn't happen anymore, as opposed to every release has the same 5 problems over and over again that has to be fixed. Mm-hmm. I touched on this really at the beginning, but ensuring that you have a standard operating procedure for how to handle these security practices. So, for instance, what happens when something is found? Do we open up a Jira ticket, or is there a different process to go about it? How are we going to go about reviewing and approving third-party libraries before they're introduced into code? When should that process be reviewed again, and so on and so forth? Figuring out what all of that is going to look like generally tends to make things simpler. In my experience, developers tend to be accepting of processes that are well documented, because it tends to make things simple and less headache and confusion overall. On the DevOps side of things, so moving from development purely to more of the DevOps side, um, having a process for conducting infrastructure posture validation. So, for instance, whether it be like a cloud security posture management tool or something else along those lines, some way to really validate that your environment is safe and secure. Part of the idea behind DevOps is we're seeing a lot more infrastructure as code deployments, and so ensuring that those are properly implemented tends to be a significant step forward. uh, Going to something like, for instance, containers. Honestly, you can ask 20 people what a container is and get 20 different answers. And so that's been a significant component of it as well. Is these types of new technologies tend to leave a lot of opportunities for confusion and misappropriation and so on and so forth. We've seen a number of clients where the way that they became aware that they had a problem with their infrastructure was they or with their software supply chain rather, was that they found a number of instances of Bitcoin mining going on inside of their environment. So having a way to really keep an eye on all that dynamic infrastructure is fairly critical. Another thing as well is having a good process around log management. I will say we've had lots of clients that have found that they have far fewer application logs than is ideal. In many cases, they're focused much more heavily on how do we troubleshoot a problem, how do we improve efficiency, and that sort of thing, as opposed to how do we actually respond to an incident? Do we have all the information that we need? In some cases, we're talking about application logs, system logs, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And then I think probably the last thing here is just making sure it's an ongoing maturity process. So you're not going to build out a world-class program overnight. If you do, I definitely want to talk and find out how you did that. But just making sure that you have a roadmap in place with meaningful goals and objectives along the way, so that everybody can see how things have improved overall. And then as those are achieved, going on and working on the next set that comes up from there.
And that makes a lot of sense. But let's talk about organizations today, the scenarios that they're operating in. What can organizations do today to get their development processes on track in a more secure manner?
Sure. So probably one of the biggest things is sitting down at first to review what the current processes look like. What do things look like? Who's seeing this code as it goes through? What type of systems are all involved in our CI/CD pipeline? Having an idea of how it all fits and how it all comes together tends to be the very first step along the way. I'd say that the next thing from there, once you have an idea on that point, is begin introducing some of these processes that we've discussed previously. Like, for instance, Anir talked heavily about application risk management and conducting those application specific risk assessments, ensuring those are in place. And then from there, we're generally focused heavily on integrating tools into the pipeline, making sure that the systems that are involved in capturing, developing, and deploying code are all integrated here, and the whole process becomes easy for developers to get feedback, and we can get them that feedback as early as possible. I mentioned before the concept of shifting left, and that's where a lot of this comes in. Is for instance, if we have to have somebody, if a developer writes the code, then it goes off to somebody else to review. They say it looks good. Then it goes to another review. And then after that point, we have a tool that all of a sudden says, oh no, you have a problem with this code. Go back and fix it. You've created you're not managing your encryption properly or something else along those lines. We have to start that whole process over again, as opposed to if the developer writes the code and then immediately the tool gives back that feedback, then the whole thing cuts down a whole lot shorter and becomes a lot more successful generally.
Mhm. Great. Well, so given your experience, Ben, do you have any advice on how to make this as successful as possible?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest things is that, or one of the biggest complaints I hear is that security can drag the process back. And I've touched on this a little bit here, but really ensuring that that security is seen as a partner in the process. Security really needs to position themselves as enabling business processes as opposed to hindering them. Um, I mentioned before, there's a lot of organizations that have a goal of having multiple commits per day, multiple builds per day, and so on. Um, and security can be seen as a hindrance that actually sets that back. And we want to ensure that that's not the case. That we're seeing this as something that's really helping to improve it along the way. And to that end, I'd say also wherever possible, make those security integrations as seamless as possible. It's a very different process when a developer has to go and take their code, manually go put it into an external tool that's going to evaluate it for security, and then provide back feedback, and then go back to fix your code. That tends to be a very cumbersome process that is tends to be underutilized, as opposed to it's tightly integrated. Right in my IDE, I can get feedback and I can know right away how to fix this process. It goes from something that becomes a huge pain to something that is very quick and seamless. And that tends to be the types of tools that get more heavily utilized and provide a lot more value overall.
Mhm. Well, let's talk about tools here. I know you started to talk about this a little bit earlier as well, Ben. What are some of the tools that can help you in this process?
Sure. So there's it's a little bit of an alphabet soup, but I'll try to effectively give a simple rundown here. The first one is what's frequently called SCA or static code analysis, and frequently this gets lumped in now with another acronym which is SBOM, so Software Bill of Materials. These are tools that tend to focus or tend to focus primarily on evaluating some of the third-party libraries that are integrated into the tools that are being used. So, for instance, if we're using a vulnerable version of Log4j, this would be a great way for us to figure out that's the case. Or something new has come out with this library that we're using. This would be a way for us to get notified about that and become aware of it right away. Um, the next three that I'll touch on, these ones tend to get lumped in together in many cases. Um, and I should mention too that really across this whole list, a lot of these are being consolidated down into single vendors that can provide multiple capabilities all at once. So you don't necessarily have this as a checklist to have to go down and check every single box. In many cases, there's vendors that can knock a bunch out all at once. But um, the the next one is what's frequently called SAST. So static application security testing is the idea behind it. And effectively what this comes down to is the code itself is reviewed. And actually, I'm sorry, I mentioned SCA stands for static code analysis. Actually, it stands for software composition analysis. Um, so, uh, so, so SAST is effectively reading through the code. This is where a lot of the things like identifying where cross-site scripting might have been implemented, or there's a poor handling of encryption, and so on and so forth. That provides some basic feedback directly back to developers around where they should be improving their code in order to have enhanced security. The next one that comes up is DAST or DAST. Very similar to SAST, but it's dynamically based. The idea behind it being the application is executed here and then analyzed from there. So this is similar to like a traditional vulnerability scanner, except that it tends to have a little more insight into the code itself and what to expect from it than a more traditional vulnerability scanner. And then the third one that kind of goes along with those last two is IAST or interactive application security testing. Um, this one focuses much more heavily on having I guess I'd say an iterative process. It effectively combines together a lot of what SAST and DAST do in order to make the process more secure in that sense. And in some cases, they put the interactive component in there by having a person actually piloting this as part of the overall process to ensure that everything is looking correct in that sense. The other things I'd say as well that generally go into it, there's ASPM, which is Application Security Posture Management, and then CSPM, Cloud Security Posture Management. These ones kind of overlap pretty heavily right now. We're seeing ASPM become a more common acronym. Effectively, these come down to evaluating what your cloud infrastructure looks like and how the application is functioning. We're seeing more and more applications are being pushed into the cloud. They're being developed first with AWS, Azure, GCP, and so on and so forth in place, so that the whole infrastructure is highly dynamic. So, as I've said before, there's kind of a bit of a alphabet soup there. Lots of acronyms. We're also seeing a number of tools as well that are showing up that effectively allow you to manage multiple feeds from these tools all concurrently, and allow you to have a single pane of glass, as it were, across what's going on with all of these various solutions.
Well, thank you, Ben. That was, yeah, that definitely seems like there's a lot of complex things out there. I do want to take a little bit of a shift here to some new news that came out earlier this week. So NIST released a new update dated Monday of this week that has a role to play here in the application security conversation. So just to give our audience a little bit of an overview, I know this is brand new, hot off the presses, but what is this new update and what do organizations need to look out for?
Sure. So this is NIST Special Publication 800 204D is what this is, and effectively it's titled Strategies for the Integration of Software Supply Chain Security in DevSecOps CI/CD Pipelines. So a bit of a mouthful, but effectively it's a strong document for providing an overview of what DevSecOps looks like and how it should be implemented. I would say that at the moment, this is definitely the authoritative roadmap on that front. One of the challenges that we've run into with this is this whole space has moved so quickly. It's been difficult for standards to keep up with it and really provide a strong messaging around that. And honestly, this is a strong signal that the space is beginning to mature, and we're going from a highly, I guess I'd say, fast changing environment to something is starting to become a little bit more established. I would say the biggest takeaway from this is that if you have developers, you really should be looking very closely at the DevSecOps space. But again, chances are, if you're on this webinar, you already are.
Perfect. Good. Well, one other conversation I want to bring up here before we start wrapping up. Anir, this is something that I know you and I have talked quite a bit about, but for those security leaders who might be listening here that may be looking to start this type of evaluation from scratch, potentially running counter to some of the development goals around speed that, Ben, you were talking about earlier, what advice do you have to translate the risk into terms that an executive who maybe isn't as technical would care about?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say establishing what you're looking to gain, right, as an output. What is your executive team looking to gain as an output? And those elements are going to come from having conversations with your app owners, your data owners, and all those key stakeholders who play a good part in giving input, not only to the process, but also the questions that are being asked of them and their teams as well. Right. So as far as like the translation of the risk into the terms an executive would understand, I'd probably highlight the importance of visibility, right, into the apps that you have in your environment. It'll leave you vulnerable to attacks if you don't have enough visibility, right? And an executive always wants to know what's going on in the environment, what are some threats, what are some vulnerabilities that are going to hit their environment. Translation doesn't necessarily have to be anything fancy. we found success in just simple trends, right? Simple trends overview charts, and presenting those in business terms. What does a great job is highlighting not only what's working for the apps, but also what may be lacking. So you have all these tools within your environment. How can we repurpose or even get additional capabilities out of a tool to support additional applications, right? Things like lack of MFA for 10 applications, for example, right? It's a big risk, but if you have Okta already within your environment or something similar, then it's easy to repurpose and deploy. And showing that progress usually speaks well with the executive teams.
And anything to add from a communicating with executives perspective?
I think that nails it. I think one other thing to keep in mind too is that we really can have increased efficiency with these types of practices, such as when findings come out from a penetration testing exercise. There tends to be a whole process that has to go into it. It needs to be reviewed by a team, figure out what does the impact look like for this change, where or what type of code is really responsible for this. There's a whole thing that has to go through in order to get that all sorted out, as opposed to if it's a matter of there's this one line that has a problem, and we have a tool that can pick that up during development, then that gets addressed not only immediately, but also it goes from taking hours or days to resolve, test, and finally implement that change, as opposed to just a minute for a developer to go through and correct one line of code.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, good. Well, we have had a couple of questions here come in from the audience. I do want to see if we can cover them. One question here relating to that NIST update that just was released. What example policies would I need to change to better align with the executive order in NIST? Anyone want to take that one?
I can take that one first. From a policy governance standpoint, I'd probably say your SDLC will probably be impacted, right? And then even your third party policy or your software development, I would say software supply policy, would probably take the immediate impact from that NIST guidelines.
Okay. Good. Another question here pertaining to a very popular topic. What role does AI play in this conversation?
Yeah, AI has been huge, right? So I'd say the vendor supported created apps are increasingly adding generative AI to their applications, right? Either as a net new feature or replacing an existing feature. Some of the integrations can be useful for organizations, some maybe not. I've advised clients to take a look at the third-party risk management space to monitor additions of AI to the tool sets, look at the features of existing providers and applications. Don't pay a premium before obtaining meaningful insights into, is this really going to help the organization improve efficiency when it comes to my applications, or reduce efficiency.
And just one thing to add to that, I think in a lot of cases we're looking at AI and so often thinking that Skynet now runs the ship. In most cases, AI is being implemented as I don't know if I'd say a bespoke system, but in many cases it's a fairly simple process. Even something like using a natural language model to respond to a question that's typed into a search box, and so having that third party management process integrated into what type of data are we sharing with whom and how is it secured really can be a crucial component for the organization.
A couple more questions here. One, our DevOps team has not been cooperative with security initiatives so far. Any suggestions to get that conversation started?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So there's kind of a lot of things to start off from there. I kind of mentioned before that ensuring that you're coming to this the approach of being an ally is a fairly critical component. I've talked to a lot of clients where uh, InfoSec has frankly been a little bit heavy-handed in many cases effectively been able to walk into many conversations and say, I'm InfoSec, therefore we're now doing X and Y and Z, and you have to do that. And this has definitely been an area where we've seen some obstruction in that sense, and some folks that are not as open to that approach. So making sure that there is a strong sense of fellowship and support for these common objectives, being grow the business, develop these things faster, be able to move with higher agility to keep up with competition, and so on and so forth. These do tend to be strong factors. Mentioning the scenario that I talked about just a couple of minutes ago about the idea of actually potentially improving the overall development time. Those those types of things do tend to help to align those conversations better as well.
And one more question here. Does secure code training play into reducing risk in the AppSec space? And how important is this? Universities are still not teaching this to our computer science majors.
Yeah, I would say this is a fairly critical component. I mean, again, the biggest thing is that we want to be able to eliminate these vulnerabilities as early in the process as possible. And if as we're getting developers trained up, if they know how to write the code securely, the first time it's coming from their fingers into the keyboard, that is what reduces that drag the most significantly. I think there's a lot of organizations that have stalled a little bit on the training processes for developers, because there's a lot of I guess I'd say overcomplication on what that really looks like. A lot of people trying to boil the ocean on how what types of things they really have to focus on heavily. And frankly speaking, you're never going to teach developers how to write perfect code 100% of the time. The biggest goal, though, is if we can reduce the number of times they put out vulnerable code by even 50%, that's a significant improvement that then improves efficiencies later on in the process. We also find that this helps a lot with remediation efforts. So lots of organizations have said we're having trouble where we find vulnerabilities with with the tools we have, but then no one's able to fix them. Developers look at this and say, I don't know what this means. I'm not doing anything with it. And having that training there, all of a sudden, instead of having to give them a primer into what this vulnerability is and why they need to fix it, they already kind of know it. So yeah, I think there's frequently a little bit of lag with universities catching up and training some of that out to students. And that's something that we've seen lots of times in the past too.
Well, good. Well, thank you so much for the questions. Thank you, Ben and Anir, for answering and sharing all this information. I think this was a great conversation. We will be posting today's webinar on our YouTube page, and you will be receiving it via email as well. So feel free to revisit the information. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at sales@tevora.com. But for now, I think we're good to wrap up. And again, I appreciate Ben and Anir your time and everyone who joined us here as well. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Chrissy.
Thank you.